Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're at, in your home, watching on your TV, your laptop, or your phone, you are a part of this family. And you can watch and listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists and search for past messages and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to Cornerstone America's podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. All right, let's get right into the message this morning. We're talking about fresh off the vine. We've been in this series talking about the fruit of the Spirit, and this morning we're going to talk about faithfulness. And over the last several weeks, we've been talking about the fruit of the Spirit, obviously, and pulling them apart a bit. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23 lists them out for us. We've kind of been going through each one, and today we're talking about faithfulness. We're getting close to being done. We just got a couple more to go, but we're on faithfulness this morning. And faithfulness is a term that you don't hear much about these days, do we? I mean, it's not very common. We don't like terms like this, and mostly we hear terms of faithfulness when it's referred to like my old dog, my old car, my old wife, never mind. Anyway, dog car, we're gonna stick with that one. Or retirement parties, right? The faithful 30 years of service that you get like a watch for in exchange for 30 years of your life. Here's a watch, thank you for your service. You've been very faithful, dependable, reliable, trustworthy, and go your way. And it's no different than it was back in Bible times. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6 says this: most men will proclaim each his own goodness, right? Guys, we like to talk about our own goodness, but the question becomes, who can find a faithful man, right? Can we really find somebody who's faithful? And ladies, you're thinking, yes, amen to that. I mean, like, who can find? No. All right. Trying to wake you guys up a little bit here. Okay, let's keep going. So in our society, we don't like to use it. Who wants to be faithful to anything nowadays, whether it's a job or a church or a marriage or a family? Relationships have become a bit disposable in our day, but God is faithful. One of the things we know is that God is faithful. Exodus 34, verse 6, when God was revealing himself to Moses and passed by him, it says this: as he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. He abounds in faithfulness. He's not just faithful. He doesn't just have faithfulness. He abounds in faithfulness. What is it like to abound in faithfulness? God abounds in faithfulness. Well, let me give you a few ways. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9 says, God is faithful, who has called you into fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. God is faithful. He's called us into fellowship. He's saved us. He's faithful to save us. God is faithful. How about 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says, no temptation has overtaken you except which is common to mankind. And it says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you may endure. God is faithful even in the midst of temptation. What about when we fail, when we are tempted and we give into it? You know what? God remains faithful because he abounds in faithfulness. 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, what is he? He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Even when we are not faithful, God remains faithful. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3 says, the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen you and protect you from the evil one. God is faithful. Over and over, the scriptures tell us that God is faithful. Even when we are not faithful, God remains faithful. Is anybody glad about that? That God remains faithful, that he abounds in faithfulness. Well, to illustrate this point, there's no better story, I think, to go to, maybe no more unusual story to go to, than a story out of the Old Testament that really demonstrates and illustrates God's faithfulness, even when we are not. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. We're going to look at the story of Hosea. If you guys know, Hosea is an Old Testament prophet, most unusual calling on his life. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So he was a prophet during the time of those kings of Judah, and then it just mentions one of the kings of Israel. And so what's interesting, his ministry was rather long. It's probably spanned about 50 years. He was faithful in ministry. He was faithful to God. He was faithful to his wife. but really lived out a very difficult calling that was on his life. And his life is a picture of God's faithfulness. And this is because very interesting, but before we get into it, the situation of his day probably isn't that difficult than our day. He lived in a day when people were going through religious motions. They were showing up to the synagogue, they were showing up and watching the priests go do their duty, but their hearts were not in it. Even the religious leaders, their hearts were not in it. And they had material success, but spiritually the people were empty. And they were basically leaving God to serve other gods. So there was material success, but there was a spiritual emptiness going on in their life. And God gives Hosea a shocking calling in verse 2. It says, when the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So very interesting call that God gives Hosea. He says, go marry a woman who's going to be promiscuous on you, that she's going to commit adultery. I want you to love her just as the Lord loves his people, that he was not just to preach a message, but he was supposed to live out this message. That he was going to be an illustrated sermon in a sense of all that he was preaching to God's people, how they had left God to serve other idols, to serve other gods, and basically had played a spiritual idolatry and adultery with God. And so this is the calling that is on Hosea's life. And God tells him basically, you're to remain faithful to her. You are not to divorce her. And I'm going to ask you to do something that you cannot do in your own strength. I want you to remain faithful to her as I am faithful to my people, even though they abandon and commit spiritual adultery on me. And basically, he's asking him to be this illustrated message to enact for the people of Israel that exactly what they were doing in a spiritual sense is what was happening to Hosea in a physical sense. So this is a drama that God wanted him to live out as an example. And we might say that's a very unusual calling, and I would agree. And a lot of things, or some of the things God called the Old Testament prophets to do was very unusual. So this is a very difficult calling. So he called him to preach a message, but he also called him to live this message in the midst of the unfaithfulness that was going on around him. Look at verse 5, Hosea chapter 2, verse 5. Hosea's wife did exactly what God said she would do. She committed adultery on him. They did have some children together, and then she committed adultery on him. In verse 5, their mother has been unfaithful and conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers, who will give my food and my water, my wool and my linen and my olive oil and my drink. And you see what Hosea is experiencing. Verse 8, she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So as Hosea is talking about, really it's double meaning here, talking about the children of Israel, how they played the harlot, but also how his wife has committed adultery and what he is experiencing. You can imagine what he is going through as his wife is living this out, illustrating what the children of Israel had been doing to God all along. And we see a picture of his grief and the pain that he goes through as he experiences his wife committing this physical adultery. And it's the same grief and pain that God goes through as his children were committing spiritual adultery. And even the pain that he would feel today as at times we commit spiritual adultery and kind of veer off God's plan and path for our lives and worship other things. And so we see this pain that is going on in God and also in Hosea. And I would say too that anytime we experience a disloyalty like that, any kind of adultery or betrayal, we go through a grieving process, almost like we've lost a loved one. And when you've talked with people who've gone through this, you see that they'll go through a lot of different emotions as they're grieving the loss of this relationship and the brokenness and all that comes with it, and experiencing depression and anxiety and anger and sadness. And so just a lot of emotions that go into this, and even a sense of feeling like they are in a fog, in shock, not believing what has just happened to them, just as if you had lost somebody suddenly, being in shock and all the emotions that will fill your heart and your mind. And even going through this, even the person that has not done anything wrong, thinking maybe even going through some self-evaluation, examination, what was my part to play in maybe the breakdown of the relationship? And there's nothing wrong with doing some self-examination, but also not assuming responsibility for somebody else's sin. But nonetheless, we see Hosea going through this shock and the guilt and the anger, and his marriage has been violated, and kind of giving us an example of what God goes through as he experiences the same thing with his people. And we go into further into Hosea chapter 2, verses 9 through 13, and we even see anger and maybe a jealous love that would be normal in a situation like this. Verse 9 says, "Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. And I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her naked body. So I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers, and no one will take her out of my hands. And I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. And I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them." Verse 13, "I will punish her for the days she burned incense in the Baals, to the Baals, and she decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers. But me she forgot, declares the Lord." And we see the hurt, we see the pain, we see the jealousy of the unfaithfulness. And there can be a lot of rationalizations. For somebody who does commit adultery, there can be a lot of rationalizations that go on, or maybe even denials. I'm not doing anything wrong, it's just a conversation. But I just want to take a minute and say, how do we know if we're moving down that road to committing adultery? Giving away our hearts, maybe much less giving away our bodies. And I'd say there's one word that would sum that up, to be a key or a warning light that would go off, we're moving down the wrong path. And that would be the word secret. If we're keeping secrets from those closest to us, if we're keeping secrets from our spouse, then we're probably moving in the wrong direction. We're moving into an area of sin and adultery. If we're covering up our tracks, if we're deleting our search history on our computer, if we're deleting our search history on Facebook, if we're deleting text messages that we don't want anybody to see, if we're deleting things if we're hiding where we went or where we've been, I think that would be a clear sign that we're moving in the wrong direction and moving into adultery, at least with our heart, if not with our bodies. Secrecy is always involved in marital unfaithfulness. So what are the secrets that we're keeping? And how does God respond to the unfaithfulness, to our cover-ups, to our rationalizations, I'm not doing anything wrong, to our denials, our attempts to hide what we're doing from him and keep things a secret? Well, I say God grieves, he's sad over what we're doing. Say he's also jealous. God is a jealous God, which becomes very interesting when we talk about jealousy. Exodus 34 verse 14 says, "Do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." That God is a jealous God. And you think, well, that's kind of weird, because I thought jealousy was a bad thing. It was interesting. There's a good side to jealousy, and there's a bad side to jealousy. We had read several weeks ago in our text in Galatians chapter 5, verse 19 and 20, that the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, hatred, discord, and jealousy. Go to my next slide. There we go, and jealousy. And so we see that jealousy is part of the acts of the flesh. There is a jealousy that is unhealthy, but there also is a jealousy that is healthy. And a healthy jealousy knows that there are proper boundaries in life, and certain boundaries shouldn't be crossed. And so that's just protecting what is under our care. There's certain boundaries, and doing life in a healthy way means there's certain boundaries I don't cross. It's crossing a line that we shouldn't go over if we want to keep our relationships safe. We want to keep them healthy and growing. But there's also an unhealthy jealousy that is really paranoid about something that's not going on. There's really nothing going on, but there's a paranoia that something is going on when there isn't. An unhealthy jealousy that tends to want to control and be abusive, and it's based in insecurity and inadequacy. And so there is a bad kind of jealousy, but there is a good kind of jealousy. Now, God does not operate in this bad kind of jealousy or an act of the flesh type of jealousy. He's not insecure. He doesn't feel inadequate. But he does know that there are certain boundaries that are appropriate and right in every relationship, and those boundaries shouldn't be crossed. And that is a healthy jealousy to have, to say that, hey, these are healthy guardrails, these are healthy boundaries, and I need to live my life within them because that keeps everyone protected and everybody safe. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. That's what God has called us to. This is what God had called his people to in the Old Testament. And he also calls us to that. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And when we don't do that, we in sense are committing a spiritual adultery in a sense. And so this is what God has called us to love him with all that we have. And yes, this is an impossible task. We can't do it on our own strength and our own ability. That's why we need him. We need his power. We need his spirit to help us be able to do this. But this is what he's called us to live by, to love him with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our strength, with all of our mind, with all of our being. And not just to love him, but to trust him. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. This is what he's called us to. It's not an easy task, but nonetheless, with his power, with his help, we can live this life. But here's the interesting thing about Hosea and his story, is that his story doesn't end with God grieving. His story doesn't end with God being angry. His story doesn't end with God being jealous over what they did. The story ends with God's faithful love being poured out on them. And that's what makes this story so amazing. And it makes it a story of an example of God's faithfulness to us. Instead of the story ending with God's jealousy or him punishing them, it ends with love. It ends with faithfulness, God's faithfulness. Hosea chapter 2, verses 19 and 20. Listen to this. He says, I will betroth you to me forever. He's not giving up. He says, I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. And then what happens in chapter 3 is very, very amazing. We don't know much about Hosea's life. This is the biggest picture that we get of Hosea's life out of his letter that he wrote here. Hosea chapter 3, verse 1. The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves the Israelites. Look, you see what he's doing here? Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. Had to do with their worship in the temple. So even though he said, let this be an example. Go love her again, even though she's been unfaithful, and let your love to her be an example of my love to the Israelites. I will not stop loving them. And in verse 2, it says, so I brought her 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. What's very interesting is what's going on here is that what happened to her was, as she was, in a sense, going out there and chasing after other men, she somehow got herself into debt, purchasing things that she could not repay them, and she became a slave. And she was being sold on the slave market. And God tells Homer to go get your wife. And he goes and he starts bidding on her at the slave market. Can you imagine this? And so he goes in there and somebody says, I'll give you 12 pieces of silver for her. And Hosea says, I'll give you 14 pieces of silver. And somebody else says, well, I'll give you 15 pieces. So actually standing there naked before everybody to see. And somebody says, I'll give you 15 pieces of silver for her. And then Hosea says, I'll give you 15 pieces of silver. So he says, I'll give you 15 pieces of silver and a bushel of wheat. That's what I'll give for her. And Hosea says, I'll give you 15 pieces of silver and a bushel and a half of wheat. And the auctioneer looks around, anybody else? Anything more? And then he takes his gavel and he pounds it down on the table. And he says, sold to Hosea. He bought back his unfaithful wife. And maybe even more amazing going into the next verse as it just unfolds in verse 3, then he told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you. Like he bought her back as a slave, but he doesn't treat her as a slave. I imagine as they're leaving the auction house, so to speak, that he takes some sort of a blanket or towel or something and wraps it around her as they start walking out. And he starts to say to her, probably so quietly and gently, you are to live with me many days, and you must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same toward you. Wow, what an example of faithfulness in the midst of unfaithfulness. And I think this is an example of what God does for us. In the midst of our unfaithfulness, right? In the midst of we get caught up in enslaved to our own egos, or enslaved to our own pride, or enslaved to an addiction, or enslaved to our desires, or enslaved to certain habits. And we're being auctioned off, in a sense, as a slave. And Jesus comes up and he starts bidding on us. And nobody can outbid him because he gave his life. He poured out his blood on the cross for us. And the final judgment from the auctioneer being God, sold to my son, Jesus Christ, the payment being the blood of my son. And Jesus takes us and he wraps us with a blanket, taking us off the auction block, and begins to speak into our lives his faithfulness and his love for us. Man, what an amazing picture. And God called Hosea to walk that out. And something should happen in us when we experience that kind of love, when we experience that kind of faithfulness. Something should change and shift in us, and there should be a growth in us of faithfulness, because the fruit of the Spirit God has placed in us, his faithfulness is in us. It's not just something he has, it's the actual character and quality of God. He has placed his faithfulness in us. And when we experience his faithfulness, his faithfulness should grow in us. And let me give you just a few ways his faithfulness should be growing in our lives. The first way is a faithful person holds to the truth. When we've experienced God and his faithfulness is in us, we should hold to the truth. In 3 John chapter 1, verse 3, it says, it gave me great joy to have some brothers come and tell about your faithfulness to the truth and how you continue to walk in the truth. Man, there ought to be a faithfulness in us towards God's truth, that we are holding tight to his truth because his faithfulness is in us, because of what he's done for us, what we've experienced. We ought to be holding on to the truth. A faithful person holds on to the truth of God, the truth of his word, knowing what is important and significant in life, knowing what is trivial and what is significant, and walking out our life, holding on to his truth, how to invest our life, how to make our lives count. Refusing our faithfulness that God has placed in us should help us or cause us to refuse to buy into the system, the world's system of living. Because the world has a way of living that is unfaithful and that is kind of fly by the seat of your pants. Just what is the new whim? What is the new thing that's out there? We have a tendency to chase after that. And God calls us to hold fast to his truth and to be faithful to that. Refusal to buy into the world's system. When faithfulness is most difficult, it's most rewarding. When faithfulness is most difficult, it's most necessary. In fact, Oswald Chambers said this. He said, God has not called us to success, but he's called us to faithfulness. He's called us to faithfulness. 3 John chapter 1, verse 4 says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. In verse 5, he says, dear friend, you are faithful in what you are doing for the brothers, even though they are strangers to you. Interesting that he's linking faithfulness now into, go to my next verse. He's linking faithfulness into giving to, I think, missionaries here. That a faithfulness to hold on to the truth is also a faithfulness to the mission. And they were supporting missionaries here. And John is saying that, hey, I'm glad that you are faithful to the missionaries, the strangers, these people that you don't know that well, but you are helping support them and help them. Faithful. A second thing, a faithful person manages money well. I think that's a good indication of how faithful we are. How do we handle money? Luke 16 verse 11 says, therefore, if you've not been faithful with unrighteous mammon or money, who will commit to your trust the true riches? How do we handle money? First of all, how well are we doing at holding on to the truth? How well do we handle money? Are we good stewards with money, or are we bad stewards with how do we do at paying our bills? How do we do at saving? How do we do at giving? How do we handle our money? Are we faithful? 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2 says, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. I think faithfulness is seen in how we handle our finances, how generous we are. Again, I just want to say, every time I receive the offering here, I always tell guys, I'm so thankful that we are generous to God. And without all of us coming together, bringing in our tithes and offerings, we would not be able to do all that we're doing. But part of our giving is an indication of our faithfulness. Are we faithful to what God's doing in our lives? Are we faithful with what he's given us? And in Luke 16:12, he says, if you've not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? He's talking about being a good steward of all that God has given us. And I like to think of life as that we're owners of nothing, but we're stewards of everything. How well are we doing? How well are we stewarding the things that God has given us? Our time, our money, our family, our finances, ministry. How well are we doing at stewardship in our lives? God's faithfulness ought to be making an impact in every area of our life. How are we doing in faithfulness? I want to wrap up and close with this thought this morning. I don't know how you guys are, but when it comes to music and me, usually I find a song and I jump on it and I play it till it's dead. Anybody else do that? You just play it over, just repeat it. You're just going to put it on repeat till you can't stand that song anymore, and then you just put that one, another one, go to the next one, right? I do a lot of that. And I don't know why I did this a couple of weeks ago. I went back to, you guys aren't going to believe this, I went back to listening to some Ron Kenoly. Anybody remember or know Ron Kenoly? Yeah. See, we got some. Yeah, see, so I just dated myself when I said that. Ron Kenoly was a big worship leader back in the 80s and the 90s, right? Still alive and kicking today, but he was really popular then. And so I don't even know what made me go back there. I just thought, man, I just feel like listening to some Ron Kenoly. It popped up in my head, and so I went back on Spotify and started playing some Ron Kenoly and listened to it, some good music. And honestly, it kind of reminds me of my dad. That's the kind of music he would listen to. So I'm not sure what that says about me, so never mind. Forget I brought that up. But in kind of that whole memory of church in the 80s, does anybody remember what church in the 80s was like? I know you guys this was great stuff. So church in the 80s, this is what church in the 80s was like. This is what the buildings looked like. So there would be flags hanging on the walls, and they just stayed there all year long. So it wasn't just Mission Month, it was all year. Flags, and probably flags during the worship too, but that's, we're not going to get into that. And instead of tables like this, there were the plexiglass podiums. You guys remember the plexiglass see-through podiums that, I thought those were cool. We got to have a plexiglass. And then you had the big wedge monitors up on stage, right? Those are back when we had the monitor. There are big wedge monitors in stage, and you didn't just have those, but then you had the plants that normally would just line the front, altar area. It just wasn't the 80s and 90s if you just didn't have those wrapping around there. And then, of course, on the microphone, you had the big foamy thing. You guys remember the big foamy things on there? Those were great in the 80s. And, of course, wires and everything that, goes with that. It's just a great time and fun stuff. But there was one particular song that I've caught on to Ron Kenoly. I knew it from years ago, and I've been listening to it a little bit. And this morning I was listening to it and thinking about it. And thinking about God's faithfulness and how it relates. So just listen to the words. It's almost like these words should be written to somebody like your spouse, like somebody you're in love with, but he is writing these to God. He's singing these to God. If you want to go listen to it later today, the song title is You Are. Ron Kenoly sings it, but for those that remember the 80s. Anyways, so he says this. He says, you are the love of my life. You are the hope that I cling to. You mean more to me than this world. I wouldn't trade you for silver or gold. I wouldn't trade you for riches untold. You are my everything. And I think when you come in contact with God and experience his love, his faithfulness, there is something in us, in our hearts, that cry out to him. You are the love of my life, right? More than anybody else, he is the love of our life. You are the hope that I cling to. You mean more than this world to me. I wouldn't trade you for silver or gold. I wouldn't trade you for riches untold. You are my everything. Man, when we experience that in our heart, we know that we have come in contact with a living God and his love and his faithfulness and his joy and his gentleness and his patience.